Welcome, everyone, and good evening from Hawaii to all of the different places around the world that all of you are currently. Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to the panelists today for presenting their papers. My name is Jan Brunson. I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology at University of Hawaii, Manoa, and I'm also on the Executive Committee for CSAS. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you all and to act as your moderator. And the name of this panel is Biopolitics and Ethics. And I will turn it over to our first presenter. I'd like to invite Nimisha Thakur from Syracuse University to start us off. Thank you so much.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I very much look forward to a discussion after this. My paper's title, which is a working title right now for a dissertation chapter, is Like the River, Our Ancestors Look After Us in This Time of Environmental Damage, Environmental Ethics Amidst Climate Change in the Brahmaputra Floodplains. This paper focuses on riverine cosmologies in the Brahmaputra floodplains of Assam, India, that allows, and I argue, for particular ethics in a time that riverine communities characterize as one of environmental damage, or what they call Prakritik Durjog in Assamese. Though my fieldwork moved across the middle and upper regions of the floodplains in Assam and bordering regions of Arunachal Pradesh, I have focused here on the river island region of the Brahmaputra's northern bank tributary called the Subansiri. Here I did immersive ethnographic fieldwork while living with members of a community called the Mising, who are constitutionally recognized as a scheduled tribe and who also self-identify as tribal and indigenous to Assam. However, they focus on their mobile histories across the different rivers on the middle and upper regions of Assam and Arunachal Pradesh in thinking through this concept of indigeneity. And so from 2017 to 22, this paper focuses on missing relationships with the river through songs, stories, and a walking ethnography of the Subansiri River Island region. In doing so, I focus on the role of environmental ethics that derive, I argue, from the contingency of riverine land itself. So I argue that because of the floods and erosion that form an integral part of riverine life, community members stress a future that is indeterminate, but because of this indeterminacy, a future is possible amidst these erratic riverine flows that people attribute to climate change, which they don't use the term climate change, which is why I will continue to use the word environmental damage to think through this ethnographic articulation of climate change. And also with increasing precarities induced by infrastructure regulations upstream, changing capitalist economies, and erratic climate change impacts on riverine flow, the Mising emphasize that ancestral spiritual practices emerge as their protection against an apocalyptic scenario that threatens their self-sufficiency so far. And self-sufficiency is something that I'll go into later on. So the first section, a mother is nurturing yet sometimes wild, fluvial contingencies as potentiality in riverine land formation. Here I begin this paper with a reflection on an ethnographic vignette where community members expressed relationships with the Subansiri as Ana Obunori or Mother Obunori in the Mising language. In the summer of 2018, as I traveled across the entirety of this region, I met a headmaster named Ohim who taught at the middle school in this region. When I asked him about missing community relationships with the Subansiri River, he replied, "We Mising call the Subansiri Obunori. In all the rivers I have seen in Assam, there is no other river with as clear and cool water as the Hubankhiri. The reason why we call this river Obonori is because when we sow our seeds for ahu rice, sometimes the waters of the river increase before the monsoon season. Then older missing folk scream, 'Look out, here comes the wild one.' But at the same time, we call the Subansiri mother. So we say that our wild mother has come to destroy our crop, meaning our mother gives us this fertile soil, enables so many crops, and gives us so much fish like the nurture of a mother. But she can also be ruthless, a bit wild, and is not without destructive potential." So here the river emerges as an ethnographic subject, but especially through missing expressions of relationality with the river as Mother Obunori. And so when the Obunori's flows are thought of as constructive and destructive, I argue that also there's a relationship of potentiality where even when the Subansiri's waters in the monsoon will flood and there will be erosion, people also talk about eroded land as being deposited in the future. So I saw across my fieldwork a sense of potentiality of land and life to continue, and which enabled their ancestors in particular to settle and thrive in this riverine land. And we see cosmologies then in myths and folk tales bring together a network of more than human kin in the form of the river as mother, ancestors who till this land, forest spirits and gods of rain, thunder, the sun, and the moon, who they argue will ensure the sustenance of a contingent riverine life today. So, in doing so, I also think through how the missing relate to the geomorphological dynamism of the Subansiri itself. The Subansiri is a very graded river. So if you go back to the slide just before this, after this one, thank you. So you can see how these river islands that I'm talking about are actually sandbars that over time will become more permanent inhabitable spaces. So community members talk about how nobody can control this river, and this riverine contingency has allowed for land to form in ways that is not imaginable by the state. And this is also a reason why the state has not yet made these lands revenue villages. In fact, when I first started fieldwork during this time, it was for the first time the revenue villages were constructed, mapping began, cadastral mapping began. And so thinking through then how when the missing speak of the river's potential to be at once destructive and constructive, they emphasize geomorphological contingency as a significant catalyst of potentiality in riverine land formation. Contingency, as discussed by Agamben, functions on the premise of potentiality as, quote unquote, potential to be or to do something is always also potential not to be or not to do, thus allowing for a range of possibilities. When the missing speak of a life sustained by riverine flows, they also reflect on that same life coming to a standstill. However, they assert that as long as the river flows, its potential to erode but also form land can continue. So, within conversations about the Subansiri's refusal to be controlled in a sense, because there are very few infrastructural embankments in this particular region, there is a big dam that is coming up 56-kilometer upstream. The community was heavily involved in protests against it. And this is a looming force that they talk about in fears for the future, because they can deal with river contingency, they say, but they are afraid of the sort of ecologies of capture, as Jason Cohen calls it, to think through how state developmental projects like dams often become a regulator of riverine flows. So in thinking then through, if you could, Saloni, please move to the fourth slide, please. Yes, thank you so much. I also want to reflect on how this particular regenerative ontology of the land itself is focused in during the revenue survey that occurred. So community members before this time would often say there was a time when we did not need or want to pay revenue to the government on lands that our own ancestors had settled. So around the second day of the revenue survey, I joined a group of 5 men, 2 community youth leaders and 3 missing community elders as we began our mapping journey of 3 to 4 hours. We reached a section which is a riverbed of a now dead channel of the Subansiri. Here, the ground under our feet was gravelly and filled with dried mud, as these once cultivated fields were being left fallow for this agricultural season. I balanced myself slowly on the narrow mud lanes dividing parcels of agricultural land and used my hands to push through the dense patches of long reeds in this once grassland of the river. Tato, who is a missing community elder, I use the term grandfather in missing to call him Tato, walks beside me and talks about the ways in which this grassland was settled by the ancestors without any state intervention after they moved to this section of the Brahmaputra floodplains from the nearby Abur Hills of the Eastern Himalayas range in the adjoining state of Arunachal Pradesh. So Tato talks about how there was a time when we did not need or want to pay revenue to the government on lands that our own ancestors had settled. The river gave us all we could want. But now there has been an increasing demand from our community and other tribal communities across Assam who fear that the state can evict them from these lands, as you have seen in many places. And this is a particular history that's related to particular citizenship and indigeneity questions that are ongoing right now. But what I'd like to focus in on here is how this term dokhali sotto, or self-settlement of lands, was used time and again by elders to describe how ancestors had settled this land without state intervention, and how being a non-revenue village had enabled a particular relationship with the river that allowed for the river to flow freely, but because with the fact that they weren't a revenue village, they didn't have embankments, and without embankments, they called this space a boundaryless land. So having a boundaryless land then meant that the river could come in and go out in a way that allowed for fertile soils to be deposited, creating this particular life world, interconnected life world of soil, plants, that their ancestors were able to till and turn into this thriving land. Saloni, if you could just move to the next one, please. Thank you. So thinking through this particular idea of sand, and sand is the first thing that people think through in this community when they're thinking about the changes that are occurring due to what they call environmental damage. So environmental damage brings in increasing blockages that are happening in the riverine flow due to upstream dams, such as the NHPC dam, which is being built. It's a 2,000 megawatt dam. It has been protested heavily, and finally, it's being constructed. So they talk about this particular time before as a time where ancestors could, without thinking about state disturbance in a sense, could till their land and till this boundaryless land in a particular way. But with these ecologies of capture that are creeping in now, people are worried. And so when I went across the floodplain, different areas, I traveled with kin from this community, from this particular River Island region. So Roni, if you could just move to the last few slides, please. Okay. Yeah, just the two before that. The one, yes. Okay, I'm sorry, there's supposed to be a sign here. So the last section here, I'll think through how over time, when I went across different spaces with kin community members to visit kin across different rivers, they talked about how, because of changing valuations of land with state consolidation, land consolidation processes coming into play, the ancestors had to be invoked through spiritual practices. And so there are particular festivals that I took part in, festivals and ritual events. And the Missing Harvest Festival of Aliyai Ligang, which focuses on the prophecies of a village council to think through the spring harvest cycle. Then there is a ritual event called the Porag, which basically is a dialogue that occurs between ancestors and community elders and youth who live in this particular house for 3 days, built on stilts, to kind of, they perform particular sacrifices of pigs and this ritual rice, fermented rice drink called appam, and how all of these are basically to retain connections to the knowledge systems that enable them to live in this contingent space, and how this is now posed as something that is required because of the sense of uncertainty that's seeping in, an uncertainty that is distinguished from everyday riverine contingencies of floods and erosion that their ancestors faced. So I'd like to end this paper by thinking through relationality, thinking particularly through, if you could just move to the last one, that would be fine. Thank you so much. Just the one before that. Yes, thank you. I'm thinking through relationality here in regard to critical indigenous studies frames of deep embodied relationships for the land that brings in aspects of more than human kin, more than human care, and more than human resilience. As Keisha Supanan points out in her work on relationality across Metis community landscapes, relationality focuses beyond inhabited environments as static, fixed entities, but instead centers an interconnected and mobile set of relationships with lands, waters, and non-human beings, as well as other humans, quote, close quote. These interconnected relationships stretch back into the afterlife as is seen in sacrifices that occur during these particular ritual events. And here I would like to think through the ways in which the liveliness of the river itself is seen in a similar way as human and non-human relationships would be posed, where being in proximate, a particular proximity to each other enables these lives to intermingle together. So missing relationships with the river then And it's now erratic flows that pose an uncertainty that is unlike the cyclical contingencies of floods and erosion, is thus not understood in solitude. Here, there is a need for a link to the knowledge systems that ancestors had in sustaining life amidst riverine contingencies. And this is required then to reimagine a riverine future amidst these uncertainties posed by climate change and state developmental projects. So earlier I had argued in reference to Agamben's description of potentiality, where potential to be or to do something is also always potential not to be or not to do. So earlier when people would talk about the riverine contingency, it still posed a path for other futures to be formed. However, when the looming force of the infrastructural, looming force of the dam in particular comes into the picture, people are unable to kind of imagine a future which could challenge the sudden release of waters by upstream dams. So thinking then through how interlocutors push back against the singular tangent imagined by state revenue notions of a singular stable future, but also invoke their ancestors to think through the possibility of continuing these multiple futures which pop in and out of possibility, as Anna Singh poses in her work on Matsusake mushrooms and foresters in Japan. So I extend this argument of an indeterminate future to focus on the ways in which the same future is disrupted by the contingencies of environmental damage in a way that requires the knowledge and relations of care that only ancestors can provide from the afterlife. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nimisha, and especially those evocative photos. That was such a nice suggestion. Just as a reminder, we'll take questions for discussion at the end, but in the meantime, you can go ahead and type that in the Q&A if you wish, so that you don't forget your questions for Nimisha, or you can speak them at the end as well. Next up, we have Varun Sandhya, my apologies. And he is from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the Department of Political Science. A special welcome to you. I invite you now to share your paper.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I have a slightly sore throat, so my voice is a little off, but okay. Is the slide visible to everybody? Yeah, okay.
Varun, would you like to put it in presenter's view?
Yeah, I'm just
Yeah, we can see it. We could see it.
okay. Okay, so this is an image from the Time magazine from the 1960s, population explosion. This is the cover of probably the second most famous book on population, Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, which came out in 1968. I'm going to read the opening part. There's a little passage from Paul Ehrlich's book. That would be my point of entry. He's describing Delhi and India. And I'm going to read that part, his description. So, quoting Paul Ehrlich, I have understood the population explosion intellectually for a long time. I came to understand it emotionally one striking hot night in Delhi a few years ago. My wife and daughter and I were returning to our hotel in an ancient taxi. The seats were hopping with fleas. The only functional gear was third. As we crawled through the city, we entered a crowded slum area. The temperature was well over 100, and the air was a haze of dust and smoke. The streets screamed. The streets seemed alive with people eating, people washing, people sleeping, people visiting, arguing, and screaming, people thrusting their hands through the taxi window begging, people defecating and urinating, people clinging to buses, people herding animals, people, 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 people. As we moved slowly through the mob, hand horn squawking, the dust, noise, heat, and cooking fires gave the scene a hellish aspect. Would we ever go to a hotel? All three of us were frankly frightened. It seemed that anything could happen, but of course nothing did. Old India hands will laugh at our reaction. We were just some privileged tourists, unaccustomed to the sights and sounds of India. Perhaps, but the problems of India and Calcutta are our problems too. Americans have helped to create them. We help to prevent their solution. We must all learn to identify with the plight of our less fortunate fellows on spaceship Earth if we are to help both them and ourselves to survive. Now, Delhi or India for Elric is not a place so much, it is a populace. It is as if populousness makes humans less human. Populousness, human populousness, has long been a Western trope to represent and understand the East, or India, or Asia, or what we call today the Global South. These places are embodied in their formidable numbers, the large numbers of people who live in these places. In turn, Western individuality or Western experience is that of being outnumbered. Western individuality is heroic and beleaguered and precious, produced and sharpened by the teeming numbers around it. I say Western, but it is really more broadly about what we call modern. And therefore, this is also internal to India, for example, or China. So, for example, just yesterday, I heard the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, when asked about India's population surpassing China's for the first time in history, commenting that it is not quantity, but the quality of the population that matters. He was, of course, taking a dig at India, but in repeating this idea, quantity means poor quality, he is giving expression to how Chinese policymakers and urban citizenry of China have thought internally about Chinese rural population for a long time. Now, returning to Paul Ehrlich's population bomb. Ehrlich was writing in 1960s about a coming planetary crisis, the crisis of feeding all of humanity. He was warning that mass famines and social turmoil were imminent because of the failure to control growing numbers of people in the world, especially in places like India. This feeling that the problem with the world is that there are too many people in it travels to us from Thomas Malthus's essay. Before Malthus, a large growing population stood for good government, economic progress, and national power. Malthus defeated this tradition and forever thematized and dramatized the paradigm of overpopulation. But where has Ehrlich's Malthusianism of the 1960s and 70s gone? Where is it today? Where is populousness today in our planetary crisis of climate change, what we have come to call the Anthropocene? Now, Anthropocene, the name that has been given since the early 2000s to our current planetary crisis that has been observed to be caused by human interference with key processes of the Earth system, already contains the history of the long debates on population growth and overpopulation that became center stage since Thomas Malthus and especially since the 1960s and 70s. For example, many of the ways in which we talk today with the language of feedback loops, systems thinking, threshold thinking, carrying capacity is borrowed talk or linked talk. When we talk about the difference, for example, between a 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius today. This kind of fine-tuning of forecasting is an echo of the overpopulation crisis of the 1960s and 70s, which was over finely tuned projections of fertility rates in the future. Even the language of carbon neutrality or net zero recapitulates zero population growth talk, ZPG, of the 1960s and 70s, taking planetary targets as a matter of individual conduct and the kind of responsibilization that we increasingly have begun to see recapitulates that this ZPG talk of the 1970s, where responsibility at the individual level was not only about the idea of limiting personal consumption, but also about not being reproducers. And here we see Donna Haraway's language, for instance. Donna Haraway's plea in our time of making kin and not babies. These are a couple of pins from the ZPG period. People pollute. I'm interested in finding ways in which we might write and think about human populousness. Those who are populous or are overpopulation, in inverted commas, we know that our modern concept of population carries this meaning. But this sense, populousness, feels archaic. Yet it is also as if populousness is a lingerer in what we understand and mean by population. So I'm interested in how we have thought and talked about human populousness in the past. So Thomas Malthus's essay, for example, becomes important for me. I'm developing a reading where I bring Malthus's population, a mathematical understanding of counting numbers of quantity, to Michel Foucault's writings on population, representing a shift from the mathematical or quantitative understanding to a biological or qualitative understanding. And Foucault is not the last word on population. I'm interested in how do we think about populousness in what we have come to call the Anthropocene. Populousness is both absent and present, I think, in Anthropocene discussions. My focus is on what is called the problem of scale here in the Anthropocene. How do we imagine in planetary scale and what to imagine with? How do we think geologically and historically and politically? How do we think beyond human and temporal scale? So in this paper, specifically, I'm trying to think about temporality, large scale time. This is why I'm focused on what I'm calling immortality of the population. And there are two versions that I'm trying to theorize and put side by side. So these two ways, in which we imagine populousness, specifically these are two temporal horizons or two visions of immortality of the population. The first, poor or catastrophic life. This is about imagining endless reproduction, endless repetition, generation binding generation. This is how Paul Ehrlich, for example, is talking about Delhi, about India. The second is what I'm calling a sterile life of extended lifespans, or at least imagining extended lifespans of a last non-reproductive enlightened generation. This is the modern biopolitical vision. What interests me is the way these two coexist. The latter, I argue, is the 21st century trajectory of eugenics and sterilization, which define our thinking in the Anthropocene. And opposed to this, eugenics as the end of reproduction. So eugenics not as improvement, not as purification of race and so on, but as the end of reproduction. I'm developing a reading of Nietzsche, specifically tracing Nietzsche's notion of breeding. Now, what I'm going to do today, take a few moments. I will read from a section titled Sterile Life in my paper, where I'm going to discuss William Godwin, the first anarchist thinker, largely forgotten. He was the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, the father of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. When Malthus was writing the essay, it was written explicitly as a reply to Godwin and Condorcet's writings on perfectibility of man and society. And a number of chapters in the essay directly address Godwin's political justice. That was a text that came out in 1793. And then Godwin writes in response to Malthus. Godwin was a prolific writer in his time, and even anarchists don't take him that seriously today, especially his population writing. So that's what I'm engaging with in this section. What Godwin helps me to think about and write about is a point that I see and I want to make, which is that the end of reproduction, in other words, sterility, what I'm calling sterility, is at the core of our modern biopolitical investment in healthy life, in immunization, in the securing and regulation of life of populations. It is not a dystopian trajectory of eugenics, a dark and fringe past, etc. In Godwin, and what I'm calling sterile life, there is a speculation and a vision of the possibility of extended lifespans made possible by the end of reproduction. The two are always together. Now, before I do that, I want to say a word on what I'm calling sterility or sterile life. Now, I do look at the Indian sterilization programs of the 1960s into the 1970s, especially in the emergency years of 1975, 1977. But I want to make clear something here about sterilization. Sterilization for me is not merely a technique or a historical moment when sterilization programs that were coercive or supposedly persuasive were implemented in India or in China's one-child policy. Sterilization is a way of imagining particular kind of life, a life without reproduction. That is what I'm after. In this form, sterilization as a vision lives, it is thriving in the present and in our futures thinking. So I'll just take a few moments to read a little bit from that section. What is the time of population? I'm interested in how we have come to see populousness as contra immortality, that is, earthly immortality, or the extending of life, or the postponing of death. I want to tell the story of how our investment in earthly immortality came into being as a response, a counter to populousness.
Hey, Varun, sorry to interrupt.
Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't see your message. Okay, I'll just end here. Thanks.
If you can take a few minutes to conclude if you like, but then we can.
Okay. Yeah. So we have not. Okay, let me just read one. Let me just read one little thing from Godwin. So Godwin is writing and he's speculating if science could develop so much that we could extend life, we could have extended lifespans. And in one place he writes, "The men therefore who exist when the earth shall refuse itself to more extended population will cease to propagate, for they will no longer have any motive either of error or duty to induce them. In addition to this, they will perhaps be immortal. The whole will be a people of men and not of children. Generation will succeed generation, nor truth have a certain degree to recommence her career at the end of every 30 years. There will be no war, no crimes, no administration of justice, as it is called, and no government. They cease to propagate because of the triumph of their reason over their passions. This transformed, asexual, non-reproductive, and enlightened generation of adults will be the last generation, an immortal generation of Earth. This, of course, is a different response to populousness than the modern biopolitical response in demographic transition theory, for example, where reproduction ceases, or that's the aim, through birth control, abortion, contraceptives, sterilization, etc. But are they so different? And then I go on to describe the sterilization paradigm. I'll end here. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Varun. We look forward to a good discussion at the end. Next, could I invite Nemat Chadha to give her talk? She's coming to us from IIT, New Delhi. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Let me just try to share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. And I think mine is the last for the symposium today. So I will be talking about, as you can see in the title of my presentation, which is Operable Bodies and Bio-Viable Lives, Ethnographic Reflections on Climate Change, Seasonal Migration, and Early Hysterectomies in Rural Maharashtra. Maharashtra is for those of you who are not aware, Maharashtra is a state in the western part of India. Now, this presentation might be a little different as compared to the other very fascinating papers we have seen today, because what I'm trying to show through this paper is how climate change and ecological change is forming the bedrock of unwarranted hysterectomies. So something like climate change is not the first thing that would come to your mind when you hear the early removal of the uteruses among women. But what I'm trying to show through ethnographic narratives of especially one woman whose life I've traced over the past few months, how early hysterectomies are very closely tied to the seasonal migration, which is induced by recurring drought for over half a century, which has gripped the state of Maharashtra now. So these are the two things which have stayed with me all through my fieldwork, and I think I find myself thinking about them very often, where women often say that, who likes to leave their home each year? If there would be some rain, we would never have to leave. The other thing which often comes along with this statement is that Maja part dukto, pota dukat, doka dukt, mi mrittucha sthiti ahe, which basically means my back hurts, my stomach hurts, my head hurts. I'm in a situation of death. Now, this presentation will discuss the high occurrence of unwarranted hysterectomies among female migrant sugarcane cutters in Beed district of Maharashtra. Now, Beed came into the mainstream media around 2019, where a lot of media reports suggested that the contractors, who were called the mukaddams in the local Marathi dialect, they're unwilling to hire female menstruating sugarcane cutters, and that private health practitioners were pushing women to get their uteruses removed by presenting a misdiagnosis. Now here, there was a very clear binary which was made with on one side, when we're talking about agency of women, that women are opting for these procedures, and on the other side, there was this whole narrative of coercion. My 12-month-long ethnographic study is based in a small village that I call Arewadi in the B district of Maharashtra, which is inhabited by the Vanjari caste, where the whole population migrates annually to work as sugarcane cutter for a period of 6 months. Now, on your screen, I think you can see the larger details of how basically the sugarcane labor is really structured in Maharashtra. But just to give you a quick overview, so a couple, a husband and a wife, are really recruited to work as a form of a unit, which is called the Koeta. Now, the Koeta works for a minimum of 14 to 15 hours, and women, of course, devote additional time performing unpaid domestic labor. And along with that, of course, these are 14 to 15 hours. So mind you, it also ends up being 20 hours on most of the days. And they're paid usually around $600 to $1,200 a year. But for every day of missed work, they're expected to give a fine of around $6 to $12. So you can see the photographs on your screen, and you can see that when the sugarcane cutters are basically migrating for 6 months each year, they construct makeshift houses using leftover cane, grass, and these houses are usually across on the factory land. But just in case they're not able to find space on the factory land, they're supposed to pay a rent of around 400 rupees to a local farmer who lets them live on the land. And you'll see that there's very little to no water which is available. They have to fetch it from long distances, and they're very poor sanitation facilities. Now, the studies which have really come out very recently in 2019, they indicate that 36% of the female sugarcane laborers in Maharashtra have undergone hysterectomies. And in 2019, 8.6% of the female sugarcane cutters across 8 districts, including Beed, had undergone hysterectomies, and this is a rate which was almost 4 times higher than the state average. Now, while this received a lot of media coverage, the reports really overlooked a very prominent non-biological correlate of these procedures. What is the relationship between climate change, seasonal migration, and hysterectomies in Beed? Now, just to take you back to how the seasonal migration really started. Now, the origins of migration from the village where I am working in, which I call Arewadi, is similar to many other villages in the district. It can be traced back to the severe drought of 1972, which had hit India in general, but also Maharashtra specifically. Now, Maharashtra, especially where this village is, it's in the Marathwada belt, which is prone to droughts every 6 to 7 years on an average, with the 1972 drought leading to the formation of the powerful toilers movement, which led to just an influx of people who were pushed to migrate to find alternative job opportunities. Now, the government of India adopted a mixed economy model after independence, but flawed agricultural policies have resulted in increasing regional disparities and seasonal migration of agricultural laborers. So these people usually migrate to the western Maharashtra, which is also not a very rain-fed area, but it's a very politically relevant area for the local level state politicians who have a stake in the sugar factories which are there. As a consequence, you will find most of the dams and tanks being constructed in those areas and not in Marathwada, from where these laborers really belong. Now, sugarcane as a crop is a very highly water-intensive crop, and it is still being grown in the drought-hit areas that receive central aid for drought proofing, but the crop is not grown using drip irrigation. The state receives about 600 millimeters of rainfall, which only recharges 10% of the groundwater, leaving only 60 millimeters of water annually available for sustainable withdrawal. Now, sugarcane requires over 1,200 millimeters of water, making it unsuitable for the drought-prone areas. With recurring droughts aggravated by climate change and non-sustainable land and water use, they've led to lakhs and lakhs of laborers becoming environmental refugees. Families in Arewadi, where I have worked, despite owning an average of 2 to 3 acres of land per household, they're still forced to migrate to the nearby sugarcane farms because their own land has become completely uncultivable because of the recurring drought. Now, the genealogical mapping of Arewadi reveals that prior to 1972, the primary occupation was agriculture on their own lands. However, with the coming of the drought, or what they call the dushkal, the annual seasonal migration to the prosperous sugar belt has emerged as a coping strategy. Of the remaining population that did not migrate or try to cultivate their own land, they were pushed to migrate after the second major drought that hit the region in 2012 and 2013. A genealogical mapping of the 120 families that I've worked with reveals a linkage between the advent of seasonal migration and early age hysterectomies among women as young as 20 years of age. Then what do hysterectomies really tell us about the disproportionate effects of climate change on poor rural women? Now, the systematic curtailment and manipulation of the womb through early age hysterectomies among sugarcane cutters in Arewadi is a very complex issue that intersects with rural poverty and agrarian distress. The prevalence of hysterectomies among female sugarcane cutters in this specific district is way higher as compared to other parts of India, which raises the question about what is so peculiar about the sugarcane industry, which is particularizing the bodies of these women as sites for economic transactions between the state, their husbands, and the private doctors. My ethnographic findings suggest that most hysterectomies in Beed are unwarranted and non-indicative, and only a handful of these surgeries were performed due to grave symptoms such as a uterine prolapse. Despite the prevalence of uterus removals among multiple women from different generations in the same family and the prevailing belief that such surgical procedures could pose dangers to the reproductive health and further weaken their ability to perform labor, women are still opting for this procedure. Now, this raises questions about the attachment of surgical interventions to the meaning of life and living for women in Arewadi. Now, through an ethnographic narrative of a woman I call Tarabai, who's a sugarcane cutter, who's cut cane for almost 50 years of her life, who despite having 6 acres of land, migrated to the sugarcane farms and underwent a hysterectomy at 22 years of age, I show how hysterectomies have become a symptom of the prolonged climate change-led migration. I hope to show the very nature of contracts that women like Tarabai are pushed to enter through the course of their lives, and how do these contracts really intersect or are tied to the seasonal migration that really happens in the area. Now, when I met Tarabai for the first time, I could not help but notice the swelling on her legs and the limp in her step caused by inflamed varicose veins. She's in her early 60s, is the eldest of 5 siblings of her mother, who's also a resident of the same village. But again, like her mother, just like Tarabai, was pushed to migrate. You can see the larger narrative on your screen, but just to give you a very quick overview, Tarabai was married at the age of 6, and she was exchanged for 300 rupees or $4 at that age by her mother. When I asked her, how old was your husband when you got married? She says, I still don't know how old he is. All I know that he had a beard then, he has a beard now. Her son, who was standing next to us, said, my father was 30 years elder to her when she got married. So when she was 7, he was basically around 30 years of age. Now, there are 2 reasons for the early marriage of young girls in this village. Firstly, among the sugarcane cutters, parents fear leaving their daughters behind in their own home villages or taking them along during the migratory season. They prefer to marry off their daughters as soon as they reach puberty through their first menstrual cycle to ensure their safety. Second, as we'll see in the case of Tarabai, early marriage was almost a means for her mother to shift the burden of providing for the children through early marriage. Typically, unless women had fertility problems among women in Arewadi, a gap between pregnancies was usually not more than 1 to 2 years. Women often joke and said, we are pregnant half of the year. Early childbearing immediately after the first menstrual cycle, followed by recurring and closely spaced pregnancies, especially in the hope of a male child, thus becomes a means for not only merely giving birth to children, but in fact reproducing a family of a certain kind that would ensure the provision of surplus labor in these sugarcane fields. And so despite her husband having 6 acres of land, the land had turned barren and they were pushed to migrate, as I already mentioned. Now, a mother of 4 children, Tarabai had a first pregnancy at the age of 13 and her last child at the age of 22. Apart from her final delivery, she gave birth to all her babies with the assistance of other women at the factory site. However, after 2 months of giving birth, she went to the nearby government hospital to undergo sterilization. However, she developed heavy menstrual bleeding and severe abdominal pain soon after. Hoping the pain and bleeding would subside, she continued to work in the fields every day to the extent that she got so scared of eating or drinking, fearing that if she urinated, she would never stop bleeding. With only a few weeks left before the migratory season, she visited a private clinic near Arewadi. Interestingly, the doctor who in fact had performed her sterilization was the same doctor who ended up, just a second. Okay, I'll try to wrap up. Was the same doctor who performed her surgery. After the bleeding, so she underwent a hysterectomy. She paid around $20,000, which is around $245. And she was only told that her uterus has gone bad. And if you don't get it removed, you will die within 4 days. After the bleeding stopped, she began working in the cane field soon after. But within 5 years, she reported symptoms of premature menopause because to remind you that along with the hysterectomy, her ovaries were also removed. Soon after, she began to experience chronic fatigue, accompanied by insomnia, hot flashes, and body shivers. Despite high blood pressure, acute body pain, and chronic difficulties, she continued to cut cane each year. I still remember her son mentioning that my mother was never the same. He still remembers her just crying out of the blue while cooking or doing everyday work. Now, what Tarabai tells me is that there is a burden to earn, then there is the fear to death. A poor woman cannot afford to take that risk, but even the doctor is fooling me. How am I supposed to know? One of the private doctors I spoke to mentioned that if a woman asks me to operate her, why should I not do it? Why should I lose a patient if I can make 50,000 rupees out of it? Now, the healthcare industry's risk assessment is influenced by social, ecological, and political factors, which lead to doctors charging high fees for the surgeries, burdening women like Tarabai. This shows an interplay between gender, risk, and the healthcare economy. In Arewadi, risk is not determined by individual behavior, but broader forces, which are social, economic, and most important, ecological in nature. Now, I expand on the works of Lawrence Cohen, and I talk about how he talks about bioavailability in his work when he's talking about the organ transplant market. What I, in fact, suggest is the conflation of bioavailable bodies and operable bodies, and looking at them through the lens of bioviability. In the context of early age hysterectomies in Arewadi, this could be used to define biomedical techniques and tactics, which are presented to these women as having the potency to enhance their lives, but at the same time, they hinder the sustenance due to the future risks. Now, Tarabai's narrative reveals how certain bodies become bio-viable, relying on social policies and healthcare inequities. Despite potential risk and death in the future, women seek immediate relief to ensure everyday sustenance in times of economic precarities, to do what it takes to make live. Now, in conclusion, what we can see is that Tarabai prioritizes short-term gains over potential long-term risks and sees hysterectomies as a means to achieve normality and continue performing daily wage labor and ensuring that her family responsibilities are taken care of. The removal of the womb then becomes a means of reclaiming the hope for a viable life and facilitating familial viabilities by transforming the bioavailable body into the bioviable body. Thus, the decision to undergo a hysterectomy right before migrating to the sugarcane farms has almost become a biosocial strategy. In fact, Tarabai was bitten by a snake while she was cutting cane soon after she had a hysterectomy. And she talks about how you don't get money for insurance if you're ill or you have an accident in the workplace, but you're only liable for any money only if you die. So what's interestingly what she says is that it's only death which will ensure some financial incentive to me, if at all, like something is going to come out of the everyday labor that I perform. Now, Tarabai's life course basically sheds light on the political engagement of women, not just as workers, but also daughters, wives, mothers, whose bodies are sites of value production. However, with the onset of premature menopause, a new meaning of disease emerges, which captures women's bodies and threatens their lives. Now, drawing on Fassin, biopower then is not just the power over life, but also becomes power over death. The last bit that I just want to say is that in times of unanticipated vulnerabilities, this power of death is imbricated in implicit yet very violent ways in varied institutions and recurring encounters with families, hospitals, and sugarcane farms. The removal of the uterus then becomes a part of the normal body that is steered towards securing a viable present while being hinged on the risk of prolonged illness and death in the future. A future which is seen as unanticipated, improbable, and only possible if the present is secure. Thank you.
Thank you for that moving presentation. And thanks again to all of our panelists as we wrap up our spring symposium. This is our final discussion. So let's make the best of it. Do we have any questions from the audience or other executive committee members? If not, I can certainly start us off if you all are busy typing and thinking your questions. Nemat, can I ask you a little bit about your description and your conclusions about Tarabai? If I followed correctly, in this case, it almost sounded like a botched sterilization, like an infection from the tubal ligation, that then the doctor had to go back in and basically do something about. And so I'm wondering how you're situating this case in the larger picture of the many other cases that you learned about and investigated in terms of those women requesting the hysterectomy. I'm trying to figure out the difference between a request from the patient side versus coercion from the medical practitioner.
Yeah, to respond to the first part of your question on sterilization. So I presented this ethnographic narrative very deliberately because one of the key findings of my ethnography has been that there is a very close relationship between sterilization, improper sterilization that is happening with these women and hysterectomies. Now, in India, the sterilization is state mandated and women are incentivized to undergo these procedures in a government hospital. Now, what you see in the case of Tarabai, interestingly, is that she underwent this procedure, she was paid a certain amount. But again, the doctors are usually not allowed to practice privately as well, but that's what's happening in Maharashtra. So when she went to the government hospital and told the doctor that I have these problems, he's like, no, you come to my private practice. We'll talk about it there then. So these very deliberate sort of infections which happen due to improper sterilization. In fact, Tarabai's mother has also undergone a hysterectomy due to very similar reasons, where the doctor had not done sterilization properly. And then when these symptoms really come in, and the doctors say that you will die within 4 days. So basically, they leverage those symptoms as a way. So, the narrative that the doctors have told me is that these women ask for the procedure, but the women that I've spoken to, they say we never asked for it. And they say that, we're not cattle. Like if you're going to cut off my arm, I will think 10 times before it. I will only get a body organ removed if you tell me that it is something which cannot be taken care of with a medicine or something like that, right? So that is something which is very interesting, because this is precisely where the public and the private healthcare intersect, where the meaning of incentive becomes very different. You know, when you're being incentivized to get sterilization, in the case of hysterectomy, the incentive is the sort of a security for preventing any future illness, or the security of you will not have to spend so much money if you get cancer. That's what the doctors tell these women, that, oh, like you've had children, you've had sterilization, you're not going to do anything with your uterus. Why don't you just get it removed? Because otherwise you'll have to pay lakhs and lakhs of money when it comes to you getting cancer in like the next 5 years. And for these women, that's why it is about securing what they have today. It's not so much about the future. That's where, you know, this sort of the nexus really comes.
Thank you. And then that connects uniquely to the fact that they're working in the sugarcane harvesting. Can you make that connection for me as well?
Yeah, so what really happens is that, so sugarcane as opposed to other crops, so it's very different, because so every time you cut a sugarcane, you're supposed to transport it within 24 hours. Now, the conditions in which they're really working in, as I mentioned, they are paid around 50,000 to 1 lakh rupees a year. And for every day of missed work, they have to pay a fine of around $6 to $12. Now, what happens with these women is that if a doctor tells them that, okay, I will give you a medicine which will cure you in the next, say, 12 months, for them, and you'll have to keep coming back to me for, you know, continuous treatment and checkups. For them, it's about traveling and missing that everyday wage, giving a certain, losing money, and yet, you know, there is uncertainty of, will this even cure us? And when will this bleeding really stop? So a lot of women who I spoke to, they said the bleeding might stop in 10 months, but how am I supposed to work today? You know, tell me what will fix me today. It's not about the tomorrow, because we don't even know if we'll be alive tomorrow. Like as I mentioned, when Tarabai got bit by a snake, she said, in that moment, I thought I'm going to die. You know, nothing came into my head about what will happen if I get cancer after 10 years. So the sugarcane industry, that way, it's a very exploitative industry in a way, where you take advance, right? It's not like basically you're paid by the work that you're doing every day. So what happens is that if I'm sugarcane cutter, I've taken, say, an advance of, say, like a lakh, you're usually never able to cut the amount of cane for that money that you've taken. So you basically take another lakh the next year. So the remaining amount gets carried on. So you're almost never out of debt. So, right. So it keeps getting like, it's almost like a ripple effect, which just goes and on and on. And for them, like traveling every day for treatment, very similar to the TB story that we see in India, the tuberculosis. Like women don't want to go to DOT center very often because they're so far. The hospitals are really far. The nearest hospital to where Tarabai lives is 21 kilometers, for which she's supposed to pay 4,000 rupees to rent a jeep. There are no roads. There's nothing nearby. There's no chemist on a 21-kilometer stretch. But with them, it's something, if the doctor tells me I'm going to die, I want to get the symptoms cured. I want the symptoms cured today, which will help me with my everyday patient.
Thank you so much. Did we have any other questions come in?
I have a question, which is, I would just ask the presenters what inspired them to take on these research topics. I mean, I'm just curious to know, so because they're so fascinating, so thanks.
Should I go first?
Yeah, any order is fine.
So I was really interested, how it started was that I really wanted to work on menopause to begin with, because I saw my mother's experience with menopause and it was extremely, extremely difficult. And there's, other than Margaret Lock's work, there's really not much which has been written on menopause among women. And while I was working on it, I came across the story in Beer. And that really pushed me to think that these women, they're also, what happens is when they're getting the hysterectomies, there are also a lot of them, the doctors also remove their ovaries in a lot of cases, which basically leads to a case of premature menopause at the age of 25 to 30, as opposed to like the age of 50. So that basically became the pivot of, and I remember like when I'd applied for my PhD to IIT, the title of my thesis was constructing the menopausal body at that time, but I was told to like make it into the laboring body and then, include menopause as a part of it. So that was basically like my anchor, because when I'm looking at my mother, who's a woman in an urban area with the facilities to go to the doctors, etc. But when you're looking at these women, when they're being pushed into the menopausal age at the age of 25 to 30, that's something which is really baffling and really upsetting to think about, and how that's really unfolding their lives.
So should I go? I grew up in Assam. So I was, in a sense, at close to the river, the Brahmaputra, but also at a distance, because I grew up, far away from river and spaces, so to speak. So when I did start working in this region, it was through actually a public health NGO. I was looking at issues of maternal reproductive health care issues in these remote regions. And but there was something that shifted for me as I moved through the space itself. The sort of mobility that these riverine lands had also created inaccessibility to particular healthcare systems. However, I think that mobility really intrigued me, because thinking through land itself and how people think of land itself as being so immersed with water is something that I only heard of growing up. So actually moving through the space, then it became about the land itself. And so I followed riverine flows with community members. And so my research design itself became very mobile. So thinking then through mobilities and thinking about the politics of land that is occurring through the citizenship questions across India, and particularly for Northeast India and its history of being a frontier, I think that sort of an understanding then really helped me to think through land itself and what sort of belongings people create across these mobile fluid landscapes. So I think thinking through then to my own memories of growing up here as a child and not being able to see land beyond the static model that the state also imposes on particular communities, riverine communities, through their land consolidation projects, through developmental projects upstream, and then thinking then through how, resistance across this space was really helped me to focus on land itself and riverine land itself.
So I do work on political theory, and it's very challenging to put, and I'm from India, it's very challenging to put India in political theory. And so I've been trying to figure out how to do that. So I have certain interests and questions that come from where I come from, but then how do I speak in the language of political theory? How do I bring all of these ways of thinking, ways of talking to what I'm interested in? So this is an ongoing challenge. So what I have tried to do, therefore, is to say, I'm going to write about India, but not directly. I'm going to write about India through one of the ways in which India is represented, right, which is this overpopulated place, right? So this is my way of writing about India. The second thing is that a lot of the literature that I read related to climate, ecology, and so on, and political theory in general, the kinds of thinkers I read, Foucault, others, they are obsessed with the minor, with the micro, with the particular, right, with the small scale, right, with the marginal, right? And so this is constantly, I have this great ambivalence towards that. Like, I love them, I cannot accept their obsession with the minor, and therefore how to think about it, how to overturn it, right? And the whole sort of ecological thinking is so sparse. Its fundamental assumption is sparseness, being alone in the nature, and so on. So all of those things I'm trying to challenge, work with, grapple with. Yeah.
Thank you very much, all of you. Thanks.
Do we have time for any final questions?
I think the time is over, but if anybody has, I think we can take another one. What does everybody suggest?
I think we might, it feels like we're wrapping up. Anna, did you have anything final to say?
I only have a few words of wrap up to link what we've heard right now in this final panel with kind of the rest of the conference. I want to speak with paint with very, very broad strokes, I guess. And I'm thinking like how to link all of these papers together. Of course, they are about biopolitics and ethics, but in very, very different ways and unique approaches from each other. And I think that was one of the beauties of this panel. And then I'm trying to think of how to draw a thread between all of our other panels and also the keynotes. So starting with, we started off this whole symposium with a keynote speech from Amitav Ghosh, which I hope that some of you were able to view online or see in person if you were here in Hawaii. And one broad thing that we can take from that is an emphasis on storytelling, on how whatever these stories are, be they harrowing or hopeful, they are stories that need to be told, and it is the crafting of narrative that helps us come to new understandings. The crafting of narrative is political, it is necessary. And then Qazi Ashraf's speech talked about many things. And one of the touchstones of that one was the inseparability of the building from the world that it's in. And this is another thing which today's keynote speaker, Shumaila Himani, was emphasizing in a way, as she spoke about ways of listening deeply to the world around us, how the social and the economic and everything we experience is also inseparable from the world beyond the human. So I think this panel is bringing all of those threads together in a very, very interesting way. And I want to thank all of the panelists for your fascinating approaches to very different topics that yet come together, emphasizing once again how everything is connected, and it is how we pay attention to those connections that can lead us to a more, both a broader and a more multifaceted understanding of how we live in the world. So thank you all very, very much. It's really been a pleasure to hear everyone's work and get to know all of you a little bit better. So thank you to everyone who is here listening and watching, everyone who's on the panel, and everyone who has attended all of our events for the past couple of days. It's been a wonderful symposium, and I'm very happy to have been able to share it all with you.
Thanks so much, Anna. I want to turn the gratitude right back on you for everything you've invested in this conference, and to Saloni as well. Thank you to both of you.
Yes, and to everyone on the EC for all of your contributions. Thanks, everyone. If we have no more questions for our panelists, then we can end this session. And for anyone who is here in Hawaii, Qazi Ashraf is sticking around, and you can come and see him tomorrow at noon here in Moore Hall.